saying that you believe that the contents of the witness statement are true, and you've signed your name underneath that statement, haven't you?
Correct.
And you did that on the 25th of August 2023.
Correct.
Thank you. Mr. Cain, it's right, isn't it, that you began your career as a journalist, but subsequently you've worked in communications and public relations?
Yes, that's correct.
In 2016, you worked in that field for the Leave campaign in the Brexit referendum.
Yes.
You, I think, were the communications head for the Leave campaign.
Head of broadcast.
Thank you. And after the referendum, you worked in various in communications roles in various different government departments, including working for Boris Johnson when he was the Foreign Secretary between 2016 and 2018.
It was the latter half of his time as Foreign Secretary, so from the final year, I think he was there, not the entire time.
Right. So 2018 at least.
Yes. Yeah.
And then when Mr. Johnson became Prime Minister in July 2019, following Theresa May's resignation, you were appointed as his Director of Communications at Number 10.
Yes, and I'd worked as well with him while he was on the backbenches during that sort of period in between.
Between 2018 and 2019?
Before he went back into Number 10, after he left the Foreign Office into Number 10.
And then from July 2019, you held that post of Director of Communications until you resigned in November 2020, so 18 months or so.
Yeah, just a bit short of that, correct.
And if we look at your statement on that first page that's on the screen at the moment, Mr. Cain, at paragraph 3, you refer to your position as Director of Communications, and you say that you were one of the Prime Minister's most senior advisors. As Director of Communications, tell us in a few sentences what was your responsibility? Did you in fact have responsibility for communications across government, or was it something less than that?
No, I think it's your broad role and remit is to provide political advice to the Prime Minister within the sphere of communications, and it's quite nebulous to some degree what control and authority you have over the wider government machine. There is an executive director. When I was there, there's a gentleman called Alex Aitken who oversees the GCS, which is the Government Communications Service. So that is all of the departments and the ALBs and the budget and the marketing, all that side of things, and the civil servants would normally report into Alex. And we would work together on various issues, but as a sort of, it's quite unclear who's in control of certain elements, but mine would be more the political, but also more of a sort of counsellor to the Prime Minister as well.
Yes, well, you use the word political, and as we'll come to see, your role was certainly not limited to, shall we say, presentational matters. You were advising him on what his strategy should be, not just how it should be presented.
That was broadly correct.
Well, give us a sense, Mr. Cain, of your personal relationship with Mr. Johnson in 2020. You say you'd worked with him for some years by then. Was he a friend of yours?
I think he was my boss, so friend is it would be presumptuous for me to say, but I think we were close. We would speak pretty much every day, and I think I had a good understanding of him. I think part of what I brought to the Downing Street operation, having worked with him for quite a long time, was just a good understanding of how he would react to information, and you get a sort of simpatico almost, the relationship between a special advisor and a principal.
I want to, Mr. Cain, to take you through some of the events of 2020 in a reasonably chronological way. And if we can start, please, by looking at page 4 of your statement, starting at paragraph 16. And you make the point here that although, as you say, there was an awareness of COVID-19 early in January of that year, it was only one of many issues discussed inside Downing Street, and you say it was a low priority at that point. And then if we can look at the next paragraph, paragraph 17, you talk about various other issues that had some prominence in January and into February: Brexit, 5G, reshuffle of the cabinet, HS2 and so on. So can you give us a sense then of where COVID fitted into the hierarchy of concern in January and February of 2020?
I think it was it started off from a pretty low base, I would say. Number 10, there was always decisions to be made over, what will be the priority issues. As you can imagine, only the most difficult issues are dealt with in number 10, because if they were soluble, they would be solved at a departmental level. So there is that constant balance of what do we need to focus on at any one time. You can see from the issues that I've outlined here, these are all pretty taxing and difficult, issues that deserve the Prime Minister's and the number 10's attention. But I think at first COVID, we were informed was, we were obviously having conversations with the Department of Health. The view was the UK was incredibly well prepared. There had been a decade of pre-preparedness, and we were, amongst the best in the world to deal with a pandemic, and it was being monitored closely by officials in the Department of Health. So I think it was quite rational at that point to assume it would be a departmental lead, and they would continue to inform us as and when was required, when it needed more attention. I think, and you can see it goes up the sort of agenda in number 10 as we move through January and into February. Yeah. Clearly, we got that assessment wrong, but I think you can probably see why we made the judgments that we did at the time.
If we could just look at the next paragraph, please, and pick up on one or two of the things you've just said, Mr. Cain.
Could you try and go a little slower, Mr. Cain, please?
Sorry.
We see there, as I think you've explained, COVID, at that stage at any rate, wasn't even, you say, in the top 5 of concerns. But you go on to say, as I think you've just indicated, that officials at the DHSC were confident of the strength of the UK's pandemic preparations, and the general view was that it was something that could be dealt with at departmental level. Does it follow that, at least at that stage, January, February, you weren't sort of worried about the priority that was, or rather wasn't, being given to COVID?
I think in January, particularly early January, it felt like we were getting the balance right at the time. Yesterday was quite a lot on individuals, but I think the actual institution that was, we are well prepared to deal with this and things are in hand. And checking those issues, if they were in place, I think is a valid one. But I think, we were probably complacent to the fact that the work was being done.
Times, and you refer here to officials at the Department for Health plans and so on. Was it just officials, or was it the Secretary of State, Matt Hancock, as well?
The Secretary of State as well was confident on the. He did raise the issue early in January. He did speak about it, at a frequent basis. So it's not like it wasn't being deal with, whatever come our way.
He raised it, but he followed that by assuring those he was talking to were placed to address the threat.
Correct. And that, of course, was still when the action plan was launched in, I think, early March, that we were well prepared to deal with COVID, and it had this decade of preparedness. That was language from the action plan. So,
and in a moment, can we look forward, please, onto the next page of your statement and look at paragraph 22. You refer here, Mr. Cain, to senior advisor to Matt Hancock, I think it must have been the 31st of January, who, according to as well prepared as the assurances that were being given. Can you tell us a little more about that exchange you had?
Yes, that was the first time for me somebody had raised they mentioned that while the no deal preparations had helped support some of the government's planning, they were sure we were in as good a place as potentially was being represented. It wasn't a sort of panic. Tension.
As you've just said, and as we'll see, the mood of confidence lasted long beyond that you've been given, or not?
So at that point, and I can't quite remember the beginning dates, I started to host professionals, which we would invite departmental heads and arms like the body heads like the NHS to come into number 10. I think part of the problem the communicators were feeding into me was we're being asked a lot of questions by the media, and we don't really have a sort of central hub where at least I was getting the information from source, so to speak, and then we'd try and shake the tide. Well, started a senior team sort of meeting in number 10 focusing on COVID. I think this was more sort of mid-February, I would
saying about the Prime Minister, about Boris Johnson's approach at this time. Paragraph 21 of your statement, attend or in fact chair a whole series of early COBRA meetings. You say that he was focusing his time on, don't you? And he took a 2-week holiday. But you go on to say that you don't now, I think, criticise the Prime Minister for this was a reflection of the prioritisation that we've discussed.
In defence of the Prime Minister, and there are certainly things that the Prime Minister got wrong, but I think in this early stage he is receiving assurances that everything actually is being well prepared and we're in a good situation to handle things, and nobody's sort of setting up the warning flares to him or to the core team. So his behaviour at this point isn't irrational to focus on some of the other issues that we shouldn't forget were large-scale, significant issues at the time.
If we could look back, please, at paragraph 18 of your statement, the last sentence or so, you refer to the fact that the Prime Minister at this stage was stressing the importance of not overreacting in the response, something he said often resulted in greater damage than the initial threat, and that he linked or likened COVID to past viruses such as swine flu. Is that something that he said more than once during that period?
It was. I think he was alive to the fact that previous health issues that had sort of taken hold in years gone by had proved to be sort of not as first anticipated. And I think he was worried about the government being swept up in a sort of media hysteria and overreacting and causing more harm than he would otherwise. And again, I think that he has a certain colourful phrase of language sometimes, but I think it was right and proper that we were looking to provide challenge to what potential options were at that point.
Now this is January or so. As we'll see, it's right, isn't it, that in fact Mr. Johnson carried on stating that he didn't want to overreact to COVID for some considerable time after that, even when perhaps other indicators were that this challenge was going to be more serious.
Yes, that's correct.
Let's just look, if we can, at INQ 0004. Thank you, page 49 of that. So we see here, this is, let's say, a month on. It's the end of February, and it's a message from you. We see towards the bottom of your message, you're saying the PM should chair a COBRA every Monday with Hancock and officials doing the rest of the week. Can we take it then that some time has passed and you are now saying things are more serious, we've got to move up through the gears?
Yes.
And we can see Mr Johnson's response suggesting that he's keen to fall in with that plan.
Yes, that's correct.
And we know that, in fact, the first time that Mr Johnson chaired a COBRA was a day or two after this, I think it was the 2nd of March. But if we can then move on, please, to page 68 of this document, and zoom in on the bottom, the green message at the bottom, please. Here is a message from Dominic Cummings to you on the 3rd of March, so the day after Mr Johnson chaired his first COBRA, a month after that January period that we were just discussing, where the message seems to be that Mr Johnson still doesn't think it's a big deal. He doesn't think anything can be done. His focus is elsewhere. He thinks it'll be like swine flu. He thinks his main danger is talking the economy into a slump. Now, you very fairly said a moment ago that in January you didn't criticise the Prime Minister for thinking more about 5G, HS2 and so on. What about in early March?
I think the Prime Minister was not alone in not doing as much as we should by early March, given the scale and the evidence that was all over our TV screens at the time. So, yes, the Prime Minister should have done more, but I think also, the team around him and across Whitehall should have done more.
What about you? Did you think by early March it was a big deal or not?
I think so. I think we all thought it was a significant challenge and something that was going to be, the only thing that we were focusing on for an awful long time. I think it was more of, how and what should we be doing at that point. I don't think there was any clarity of purpose, any really serious outlined plan to deal with COVID at that particular point. And I think that was the core failure was, what were we supposed to do? I'm not an epidemiologist. That's not what the expertise I would bring. I think, there was a lack of clarity of what we should be doing at that point, really.
Well, let's come on to that, Mr Cain, because, of course, that message was sent on the 3rd of March, and that was the same day, in fact, as the COVID action plan that you've already mentioned was published. You refer to this at paragraph 30 of your statement on page 7. I think it's fair to say you're quite dismissive of
Contain was really off the table. So, it just felt a strange document for people to be referring to as an actual government plan at that particular time. And I think that was an area when, quite a few people in Number 10 were starting to get concerned, because if this is the plan, then we clearly don't have a plan.
Did you take a part in drafting that plan or the document?
I'm sure I would have been involved in discussions with it. I can't quite remember. Quite a few people in Number 10 were starting to get concerned, because if this is the plan, then we clearly don't have a plan.
Did you take a part in drafting that plan or the document?
I'm sure I would have been involved in discussions with it. I can't quite remember the depth of my involvement.
Did you have the concerns that you're expressing now at that time?
I think I had concerns that we didn't have. I mean, the document itself was not, that it wasn't the issue. The document itself is fine. The purpose for the document was a concern, and I think that's when there was, challenge made of, okay, well, what is our actual plan at this point?
We can see the last sentence of that paragraph there. You say, the fact that many senior figures kept referring to the document as, quote, the plan, this document that you've described as being very thin, shows that in reality the government had no plan to deal with the pandemic. Is that something that you felt at the time?
Yes, it was. I mean, there was I say we talk about flattening the curve, and there was a strategy, but there wasn't a plan, which I think is the detail of how you're going to do these things was somewhat absent.
Did you raise concerns about it then?
I honestly can't remember the details of the concerns I raised at that point. I think I would have spoke to people about because I think the challenge for us is we were getting information from the media. It'd be like, okay, what are the fundamental details around that? And I remember at the time we were not able to provide a lot of that, colour and detail underneath it. So I'd have raised that from a media perspective, but I wouldn't have been challenging the sort of scientific assumptions. No.
It was at around this time, and we may hear more detail later today, that Dominic Cummings was demanding to see the plans, calling particularly for the Department of Health to provide these pandemic plans that everyone had spoken so much of. Were you aware that he was making those inquiries, requests, demands?
Yes, I was. I think at that particular time there was probably only Dominic who was really forcefully being agitated and sort of kicking the tires quite robustly. I don't think he got a great deal of information back, if I recall.
Now we know that the week that followed the publication of the action plan, the week starting on Monday the 9th of March, leading up to the 13th, was an action-packed week. There were at least 2 COBRA meetings, and we'll come on to mention the discussions at the end of that week and the weekend that followed. But first I'd like to go back to the earlier 48313 document, please, and look at page 22. Yes. Thank you. So this is a text or a WhatsApp sent by Dominic Cummings to Boris Johnson on the 12th of March, so the Thursday of that week, where he says, "We've got big problems coming. Cabinet office is terrifyingly shit. No plans, totally behind the pace. Me and Warners and Lee Slacky are having to drive and direct." I take it that the Lee there is a reference to you,
Yes.
Cain. I don't think you received that WhatsApp, but do you remember during that week being one of those group of political advisors who were somehow having to drive and direct the government machine? Is that something you would normally expect to have to do?
I think that the communication side drove a huge amount of the government machine during my entire time. Often, actually, in terms of looking at areas of policy, it's often comms colleagues that can find the holes and see where the problems are, because you get an understanding of where journalists will look and where things might unravel. So you're often kicking the tyres. I felt in COVID more than anything, actually, there were periods when a lot of the policy was having to be drafted by, or certainly shaped by, communications professionals, because there wasn't really anybody else doing it to any great level, which was a surprising thing to have to be dealing with from my side.
I want to press you a little bit, Mr. Cain, about whether the extent to which you endorse what Mr. Cummings was saying here. He's clearly saying, isn't he, that the reason that you and others are driving and directing is because those who should be doing it, that is the Cabinet Office, are not. To use his words, they are terrifyingly shit. Do you agree with that?
I might not quite use the same language, but generally, yes.
So, can you give us a bit more detail then? I mean, who was it? Were individuals or sections within the Cabinet Office that were failing at that crucial moment?
I think the point really was nobody quite knew, who was the point person, who was in charge, who should be driving this machine, who is meant to be in charge of coordinating of all the policy. If you ask me now who was supposed to be doing that in those early weeks and months, I couldn't tell you. There was nobody holding their hands up, taking responsibility. It would move around, and it fundamentally, like all problems, comes into number 10 and a small group of people who have to make the best of things.
Well, just finally on this, presumably the Cabinet Secretary would usually be someone who would take a lead in responding to a developing crisis. Mr. Cummings makes no bones about his views about Mark Sedwell's conduct at this stage. He says he's out to lunch, he hasn't a Scooby what's going on, and his own officials know that. What do you say to that?
I was had a good relationship with Lord Sedwell. I think he's an incredibly talented official. I wouldn't have known where the responsibility came for who should be doing X in the Cabinet Office. I would be looking probably a lower level, DG level, maybe for someone to lead that. So, I couldn't really comment on that.
But overall, is this fair? You may not use those words. You perhaps didn't have as much to do with Lord Sedwell as he is now as Dominic Cummings, but the general theme of lack of leadership, chaos, if you like, is one that you agree with?
Yes.
Let's move on. I want to ask you about the discussions around the first lockdown decision. And if we can start by going to page 8 of your witness statement. We see there the heading, amended strategy, nationwide lockdown. That's the description, isn't it, of the change from the mitigation strategy to the lockdown suppression strategy that we've heard a great deal about in the last few weeks. And we've also heard from other witnesses, and we will hear from others, about that series of meetings that took place on Friday, the 13th, and then into the weekend, where that decision crystallised. Is that fair?
Yes.
I just want to ask you really about two issues relating to that sequence of events. And the first, if we look at paragraph 33, you describe there as part of the reason for this change of tack what you describe as new modelling overseen by Mark and Ben Warner showed that unless the government urgently changed course, the NHS would be overwhelmed within weeks. If we just zoom out, again, we can see you make a similar point again at paragraph 34B. We don't need to go to it, but you refer to the new modelling, which I take it you mean the modelling you describe in paragraph 33. Was your impression then that at around this time, towards the end of that week, something had changed in the modelling or the numbers, which was telling you something about the threat to the NHS which hadn't been known before?
So I think it was our assumptions at this particular time and what we'd been told in the weeks prior that a suppression strategy wouldn't work. People could only sort of undergo sort of 12 weeks of this kind of, hard measures. So I think it's important to understand this. So suppression wouldn't work, and if we did suppress, as soon as we unlocked, we would then see a second spike, NHS overwhelmed. So I think it's important initially to say that the reason we didn't even consider or discuss a suppression strategy at that point is because the information was it wouldn't work. Now, at this point, we're obviously on the mitigation sort of strategy, which the core of that was along, to flatten the sombrero, wherever we were.
Squash the sombrero.
Yeah, that's the one. Which was a long, sort of elongated sort of peak that would stay underneath the capacity levels for the NHS and ensure that, when we did alleviate those measures, there would be a certain amount of herd immunity within the system. Important to reinforce that herd immunity wasn't a goal. We were told that herd immunity was an inevitability. Therefore, but how would we manage that? So that was the plan. I think what this, new modelling, I was first aware of. Mr. Cummings grabbed me on the Friday and said that I wasn't in the actual core meeting. I think that happened that day, dealing with something else. He grabbed me and said, Ben and Mark had gone off and crunched the numbers, and whether it's new modelling, whether it's they look through, and actually our current plan means that we're going to not just go through the NHS capacity level, we're going to absolutely smash through the NHS capacity level, and we're going to be looking at thousands of additional beds that we don't have, and ventilators and all these other things. So tens of thousands of people are going to die on this particular plan, and the NHS is going to be totally overwhelmed, and it's going to be worse than the scenes that people have seen in Lombardy and elsewhere. So at that point, the only course was an urgent change of plan. So on the Saturday, it was, he said to me, we're going to speak to the Prime Minister with a very select core team, talking through the issues of the three scenarios I've seen.
And so on. I'm going to come to that meeting in a moment, but I just want to come back, if I may, to this point about the NHS being overwhelmed. And I think you've explained it very well, which is that you had previously understood that the mitigation strategy, as well as being one that was necessary because suppression wouldn't work, as you said, but the mitigation strategy could be achieved without overwhelming the NHS, and that this was something new that you were being told in these few days.
Yes.
That actually that's not right, that the NHS is going to be overwhelmed. Is that fair?
Correct. And I think the lack of data we had at that point is absolutely staggering in terms of, very early on, there was no dashboard, there was no live information flow, no understanding of, we would basically have a meeting where Dominic would ask certain people like Sam Stevens on, how much bed capacity there was, and it'd be jotted down on a whiteboard. There was no use of serious technology and data to try and get a live sort of minute by minute update. So we were very much behind the curve on all those sorts of areas.
Just sticking with this point about the NHS and Mr. Cain, because the evidence the inquiry has heard is that other people, in particular, for example, on SAGE, the scientists there, it had been apparent to them for some time. For example, Professor Medley said that, in his words, throughout February, it became increasingly clear that NHS capacity in the UK would be overwhelmed, and that's under the mitigation strategy. And others gave evidence to a similar effect. But if that is what they were thinking, and they tell us it was, it seems that wasn't a message that was getting through to you at the heart of Downing Street.
No. I mean, obviously, SAGE is a very broad church, and with a lot of different views and a different counterpoints, and we would rely a great deal on Chris Whitty and Patrick Vallance to which I think both did an exceptionally good job of broadly giving a sort of coalesced view of that broad church. So we would often take the steers from them, which I think was the right approach.
Short point. 13th of March, or thereabouts, the warners say, look, under mitigation, the NHS is going to be overwhelmed. That was news to you. That's not something you had heard before. That was news to
me at that point.
The second point I want to take you to, that takes us back to the meeting on Saturday, the 14th, which you referred to a moment ago. I think there was a late night discussion between advisors on the Friday, and then a meeting with the Prime Minister and others. I think probably more than one meeting the next day on the Saturday.
Yes.
And if we can look, please, at paragraph 35, it's on the screen. You refer to that meeting. We've heard from others about it, and we'll hear from more people still. But if we look 5 or 6 lines down, you say there, the collective agreement in the room was that a full lockdown was the only strategy which could suppress the spread of COVID-19, save the NHS from collapse, and ultimately by the government more time. Flattening the curve could only really work as an interim measure until full lockdown could be achieved. So is it fair to say, Mr. Cain, that there wasn't a sort of a decision made at that meeting to impose a lockdown, but as you put it, there was a collective agreement that really that was inevitable?
Yes.
And as we know, that lockdown was indeed announced, but not for over a week. It was on Monday the 23rd, so 10 days later that it was in fact announced. Looking back, was that a longer period than you would have anticipated as of the Saturday, the 14th of March?
Yes, but I think you also have to consider it's quite a big undertaking to lock down the entire country. You know, there needs to be provisions. There's got to be guidance drafted. There has to be legislation penned. You have to be able to take people with you. The cabinet have to have agreements. So there's an awful lot that does have to happen in that space. All the communications we had to plan. So while it was longer than we would like, I think there is a justifiable reason as to why it has taken that time.
There's a lot to do, and I'm going to bring you to these points in a moment. You've described many of the things that had to be considered, and the wheels of government perhaps don't necessarily turn as fast as you would like. But also it's important to say that this was a very grave decision to take, and so the damaging effects of lockdown had to be considered as well. Is that fair? Let's look, please, at paragraph 40 of your statement on page 10. You do say in the first sentence there, the implementation of the policy, and that's the lockdown policy, isn't it?
Yes.
The implementation policy was delayed. And then you go on in the rest of that paragraph to make very much the point you've already made about the wheels of government turning and all the things that had to be put in place to achieve that decision. I want to ask you about what is perhaps another theme, though, of your statement, which is that another cause of that delay, if we want to call it that, was indecision on the part of the Prime Minister. And if we go to paragraph 42, please, so it's, yeah, we already have it. You say another challenge was that the Prime Minister would occasionally oscillate between lockdown and other potential policy options, a recurring theme during the critical decision points of COVID, and to some degree understandable given the gravity of the decisions. You say he worried about the impact on the economy. We've already seen that. And then you say this in the next paragraph: the system works at its best when there's a clear direction from number 10 and the Prime Minister. These moments of indecision significantly impacted the pace and clarity of decision making across government. What were the Prime Minister's concerns around this time, Mr. Cain?
I think they were similar to the ones we've raised earlier on, you know, is the government overreacting and will the cure be worse than the disease? I would say that it's pretty easy for advisors like myself to say Prime Minister should have done X, Prime Minister should have done Y. I do think that, you know, this was probably one of the biggest peacetime decisions, you know, in recent years that Prime Minister's had to undertake, and it clearly weighed incredibly heavy on him. And, you know, I think it's him and him alone who has to take that decision. So it is understandable that he wrestled with it. I think, so I have few real concerns over this period of time. I think, well, I'm sure we'll come later to the summer and the second lockdown where I think it's slightly more difficult to defend.
Well, it's of course right that such a profound decision as locking down, with all of the damaging consequences that would follow, has to be carefully thought through. But it's right also, isn't it, that if one adds to that factor, what your word, oscillation, a degree of inability to take a decision, that can be a damaging thing, can't it?
Yes, I mean, decisions can sometimes be worse than the wrong decision in certain circumstances, and I think indecision probably was a theme of COVID that people did struggle with inside number 10.
I'd like to ask you about a WhatsApp exchange between you and Lee Cain that took place during this period, the week between Friday the 13th and...
Sorry, between myself and...
Dominic Cummings. So it's 267920, please.
Whilst Mr O'Connor's getting that document up, Mr Cain, do I understand from what you said earlier that you would defend the 10-day gap between the decision taken that there had to be a national lockdown and actually implementing that decision? Because I find that curious.
As I said, I think it is longer than you would like, but I think it's important just to emphasise the amount of things that had to be done and the amount of people we had to take with us to deliver a nationwide lockdown. It's a huge, huge undertaking. And to be honest, my understanding of government, that is government moving at a tremendous speed, which maybe says more about government than other things. But you know, the machinery did feel like it moved quick for the machinery, but it's long. You know, it's definitely longer than you would hope.
Thank you. Let's look here, Mr. Cain. Let's not worry about the very top message, but second one down, there is a series of 4 messages from Dominic Cummings to you, and I think it's apparent that Mr. Cummings is in a meeting with Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak, and he says, first of all, get in here. He's melting down. Before I go on, let's just note the date. So it's the 19th of March. So the Thursday of the week after that Saturday meeting that we were just discussing. Then he says, Rishi saying bond markets may not fund our debt, etc. He's back to Jaws mode wank. What does he mean by that?
The PM at the time would refer to the mayor of Jaws from the film, who wanted to keep the beaches open. I think he had a routine from previous in his career where he would use that as a joke from one of his sort of after dinner speeches. But he sort of said, you know, there's more harm coming. The mayor was right all along to keep the beaches open because it would have been a long-term harm to the community. So it's a sort of reference to that.
And then Mr. Cummings says, I've literally said same thing 10 fucking times. He still won't absorb it. I'm exhausted just talking to him and stopping the trolley. I've had to sit here for 2 hours just to stop him saying stupid shit. And you say, I'm exhausted with him. There's then a gap for an hour. And it may be that there was then a press conference because you then forward a tweet about someone who perhaps was watching that press conference saying that they were confused by what Boris Johnson has said at it, and you say, as your message, no words. And then Mr. Cummings says, what did I say? It's only a matter of time before his babbling exposes the fact he doesn't know what to say. Now, the first thing to ask you, Mr. Cain, I mean, I think it's apparent from what you've already said that Dominic Cummings was someone you'd worked with for some time. You clearly had a close relationship with him. Was this just chatter? Was this just banter, if you like? Were you just agreeing with him because he was your friend? Or did you actually mean that you were exhausted with the Prime Minister and that you were despairing, if you like, of what he was doing and saying?
I think anyone that's worked with the Prime Minister for a period of time will become exhausted with him sometimes. He can be quite a challenging character to work with just because he will oscillate, he will take a decision from the last person in the room. I think, you know, that's pretty well documented in terms of his style of operating, and it is rather exhausting from time to time.
You made the point in your statement, and you've made it again today, Mr. Cain, that if one is in the position of the Prime Minister and considering such a profound decision as ordering a lockdown, it's perfectly appropriate to weigh that decision carefully and to think about all of the negative consequences that will follow. But that's not what you're describing here. what we're seeing here in that critical period is someone who simply can't make up their mind and with whom two of his closest advisors are exhausted.
I mean, I think that's correct. I think there is a difference between weighing up the evidence and, you know, looking for challenge on policy issues and being sure that we are making the right decision. I think issues like if I remember correctly, the tweet there from Steve Swinford was regarding the press conference where I think he announced that we were going to turn the tide within 12 weeks, which we were frustrated by, because I think the whole point of the suppression strategy, Chris and Patrick would be very clear that the suppression strategy would be a long-term endeavour. We were looking at, you know, probably a year where we were going to have to do pretty hard measures, alleviate them a little bit, go back into hard measures again to keep control of the virus until, you know, we were in a situation where a vaccine or another method came online, testing that would allow us a route out. But we all knew it was a long-term challenge. And I think from a communications point of view, the Prime Minister indicating that we you know, basically could be finished with COVID in 12 weeks was unhelpful, because it set a very unrealistic sort of expectation of where the nation needed to be, because it's all about compliance at this point and being honest and transparent with the public about what to expect and how to expect it.
Mr. Cain, you say it was unhelpful. One might think that was quite a well-chosen word from the communications world. Mr. Cummings is clearly expressing the view to you at the time, in the context of that, that he doesn't think the Prime Minister is up to the job. Did you agree with that?
I think at that point, and that's quite a strong thing to say, I think what will probably be clear in COVID, it was the wrong crisis for this Prime Minister's skill set, which is different, I think, from not potentially being up to the job of being Prime Minister.
What do you mean by the wrong crisis for this Prime Minister's skill set, Mr. Cain?
Could we use just straightforward English, Mr. Cain, please?
So I think he's somebody who would often delay making decisions, would often seek counsel from multiple sources and change his mind on issues. Sometimes in politics that can be a great strength. I think if you look at how he navigated Brexit, he allowed others to make decisions and, you know, jumped in the last minute, can take political advantage. I think if you look at something like COVID, you need quick decisions and you need people to hold the course and, you know, have that strength of mind to do that over a sustained period of time and not constantly unpick things, because that's, you know, where the problems lie. So I felt it was the wrong challenge for him mostly.
Right. Let me move on, Mr. Cain. I want to ask you a few questions about various communications strategies during the pandemic.
Just before you do, Mr. O'Connor, I'm just trying to work the meeting on the 14th of March. Everybody at the meeting and the Prime Minister at the time was there. So Boris Johnson was there.
The Saturday meeting, I think, was quite in a team. So I can't remember if CMO and CSA were there, but it's more the private office, political advisors. The following day was a wider cast list, if I recall, for a subsequent meeting on it.
But it was agreed that we'd have to go into national lockdown.
Broadly, I mean, it was agreed that we needed to suppress, and we need to suppress urgently, and then it was a case of how we do that, yes.
So what I want to know is, did the message then go out to all government departments? Basically, we're in war mode. You're going to have to start working out how we're going to cope with the national lockdown, how we get it into place. Was that the message that went out, or was there still oscillation in the days that followed as to whether we were going into a national lockdown? Had the decision been taken that weekend or not? The
decision can only be taken by Cabinet. So I think it had to go through Cabinet processes before that could move forwards. But I still think there was a certain degree of uncertainty of exactly what it would look like.
Presumably a Cabinet meeting could be called very quickly in times of emergency?
Yeah, I think it could, yes.
Was it?
I can't remember when. I think it was in days, but I can't remember how quickly.
Sorry to interrupt, Mr. O'Connor.
No. As I say, Mr. Cain, I want to move on. You talk about the stay at home, protect the NHS, so will remember. That campaign having been conceived, including you and some one or two people from a digital creative agency who between you put that campaign together. And then at the next paragraph, paragraph 99, you refer to the fact that it was well regarded at the time, and people have praised that campaign subsequently. I mean, do you personally hold the view that that was a successful and effective campaign?
Yes, I think the only critique we got that it was too successful, which, and subsequently, people, some behaviours were hard to remove people out of. But I would push back on that really and say it did what we needed it to do.
I want to ask you a little bit about the middle section of that of the campaign slogan, the "Protect the NHS." We know, of course, we were discussing it a few minutes ago, that the need to stop the NHS being overwhelmed was one of the triggers for the lockdown. But it's also right, isn't it, that even at that very early stage of the pandemic, it was known that certain groups within society, elderly people, the disabled, people in care homes and so on, were at a heightened risk from COVID. Wouldn't it have been better to, instead of saying protect the NHS, come up with some language to encourage people to protect those people who were at the greatest risk from COVID?
No, I think in all due respect, I don't think so. I think that this was about ensuring we had maximum compliance. It was about ensuring that we were stopping the spread of the virus. That is the best way to protect everybody. The NHS has a very sort of special place and significance in in British culture. It's very powerful, and I think the slogans it stands. As I say, we had to be looking at numbers of 94% of the public understood it and taking part, and the compliance rates show that it was very successful. As with anything, there's always things you can do better, but I think as a campaign, as a call to action, delivering what we needed to do, I genuinely don't think it could have been much better.
Given that you decided to use the reference to the NHS in the slogan, did you consult with the leadership of the NHS about how they should be referred to and the fact they were going to be included in this slogan?
I didn't directly have conversations with leaders of the NHS. The government machine will obviously keep everybody informed as to what the plans are and what we are communicating. That it will always go through, and no concerns were raised to me at any time.
Are you aware that subsequently, and I think during the pandemic, the NHS leadership did criticise this campaign? In particular because the concept of protecting the NHS created a risk that people would delay seeking medical treatment that they needed for other urgent non-COVID related health problems such as sort of heart problems or cancer or those sorts of matters. Did you know that that was a concern that the NHS had? And frankly, I think that their view was that they weren't consulted, using that term.
Only after I'd left government, I think that had been brought to my attention. I would strongly stand by the campaign. I think our overarching goal was to protect and save as many lives as possible. And we believed that this was messaging in a campaign that did that. I think if we look at why people weren't going to hospital at the time, it's because they were looking at what the scenes were in Lombardy and elsewhere and were frightened. I think there's a false perception that the messaging caused fears in people, but if you actually look at the metrics of where fear spikes when the virus spikes. People are very rational. They can see when they're most at risk, and they look to protect themselves in very sensible ways.
Mr. Cain, one of the reasons people weren't going to hospitals is because your campaign was telling them to not to use the NHS at that time because it was needed for the COVID pandemic. Isn't that right?
No, and I don't think that is what the campaign is telling people to do. And I think we were clear throughout COVID in interviews and other forms of messaging that obviously people with serious health concerns should seek help and go to to whether it's emergency care, wherever it is, as they would previously do so. What we were highlighting that there was a broader need for people to break contact. That was in order to provide care for those who needed it, and that would fundamentally save lives. And I'm very proud of what the team achieved during that period.
We have evidence that in fact the NHS were so concerned about the impact of this messaging that they had to develop their own communications campaign, as it were, encouraging people themselves to come back to hospitals with non-COVID related issues. Were you aware of that? It was called the Help Us, Help You campaign.
So we would have regular meetings with senior communicators from NHS England and from Department of Health. Never was this issue raised at any time with myself directly, and we say we would have these calls every week, if not multiple times a week. And I would also say that it's of course right and rational that the NHS should look to do sort of micro-targeted campaigns to those who may be at greater risk. That's of course very wise, but our approach, in number 10, is to try and have the maximum benefit as possible and save as many lives as possible. So, if you're looking to move into more nuanced spaces, it obviously breaks down the overarching message, and you could have wider negative contexts of, if we had lower compliance, the negative outcomes overall would be worse. So it's sometimes, not making the perfect the enemy of the good.
I'm going to move on just to a related subject, Mr. Cain. We have heard evidence about the SPI-B committee. I heard evidence from Professor Rubin, who was one of the co-chairs of that committee. And we've also seen their terms of reference when they were set up by SAGE, which emphasised the importance of public messaging, and one of, if not the most important part of their role, was to provide the government with behavioural science advice, including in relating to public messaging. To what extent did you utilise the expertise of SPI-B when formulating government messaging?
I think the broad view was slightly questionable of some of the insights of SPI-B, so I didn't have a huge amount of dealings with them at that particular point, and the sort of dealings I did, I didn't find particularly helpful. We do via focus groups, via polling, things that we'd seen, we'd used pretty readily in political campaigning that was incredibly effective. Often they would be slightly different places to where SPI-B were, and I would trust the judgment of the campaigners and the messaging people we used, which was some of the best in the world, if not in Western Europe.
The evidence that the inquiry has received from Professor Yardley was that SPI-B was not consulted about the stay home, protect the NHS, stay alert, control the virus, save lives, nor about Eat Out to Help Out, nor about the Freedom Day slogan. So is it, in fact, campaigns during the pandemic?
I think some of those. I think some of those slogans were ones that I myself didn't agree with and weren't particularly consulted on. So it's slightly different. But I think on the main government messaging, we, as I say, I've seen the critiques of the stay-home messaging, the critiques that we shouldn't use, some of the fear messaging, and they were at odds with the feedback we were getting from our own research, which I think the evidence of compliance and other things would suggest were correct.
Mr. Cain, one of the functions of this inquiry is to think about future pandemics. We know that SPI-B or a similar committee had existed in I think it was the 2009 swine flu epidemic. SAGE thought it was a useful body to reconstitute in 2020, as I've said, with messaging being one of its most important focuses. I mean, is your evidence to the inquiry that when the next pandemic takes place, we shouldn't bother with seeking advice from behavioural scientists at least about public communications and messaging? We should just rely on focus groups and experts in the communications field?
I think that we should seek advice wherever we can get it, but I think we should also say that the behavioural science isn't always correct. I think there's different kind of messaging challenges. I think I spoke regularly with Chris Whitty and Patrick Vallance throughout this period. I would inform them about a lot of the communications. They would provide feedback. At no point did they say we should be taking on board some of the SPI-B advice that was provided. And as I say, the things that I did see, I disagreed with. Now, if I got those things wrong, then that's my responsibility. But I fundamentally believe the messaging and the communications that we had were the right ones. I think the team who were part of those did an exceptionally good job. And I think there is government has some absolutely incredibly talented communicators that I was proud to work alongside.
It's still quite a striking thing, though, Mr. Cain. You, as
to look at the compliance, look at the evidence of the strength of the campaigns, and I would stand by those campaigns being incredibly effective. As I say, the Stay Home campaign, was seen as one of the most powerful public health campaigns in modern memory, with 94% of people understanding and complying with the messages that it sent, and that framework it gave us, I think, went a long way to saving a significant number of lives, and I'm very proud to have been part of it.
Mr. Cain, I'm going to move on to just a couple more issues around communications. Firstly, I want to ask you about the extent to which you considered communications across the UK as opposed to England. Of course, we're focusing on 2020 and the messaging during the pandemic. Did you regard it as your role to be thinking about communications across the UK or communications in England? Or did you not really think about the difference between those two things?
I think you would broadly look at across the UK, and that's where I think part of the work with Alex Aitken, who focused a lot more on the paid advertising, for example, where I think that your paid media is slightly different from your earned media. The earned media we would focus predominantly more on the Prime Minister and England, where the paid media would be more of a UK-wide approach, which Alex would lead and push through. The challenges, I assume you're moving to, actually become more about politics than communications quite often. And I think that's where the challenges in this space really Cain.
Well, let's.
The challenge is, I assume you're moving to actually become more about politics than communications quite often. And I think that's where the challenge is in this space, really, Cain.
Well, let's look at a document, Mr. Cain. It's 214168, please. I know you're familiar with this document. The context is it not, that as the first lockdown was being eased, at least in England, and the stay-at-home message that we were just discussing was being replaced in England by the stay alert message, there was pushback, at least from Scotland and Nicola Sturgeon's government, to say they didn't want that message to be used in Scotland because it didn't, in fact, reflect their public health decisions that they were taking in Scotland. Is that a fair summary?
Correct.
And what we see here is an email responding, if you like, internally. So it's from Alex Aitken, who you've mentioned, to Martin Reynolds, but we can see you're copied in on the response just above it, describing this problem. And if we cut down to the headline, which is a point 9 in bold, recommendation, brackets for ourselves, despite the objections from Scotland, run the campaign nationwide and work with the devolved administrations to deliver the most effective campaign and deconflict if necessary. Was that what you understood?
Yes.
The sort of the policy to be?
Well, so there's different things. We're talking about the messaging and the policy. This is fundamentally a question of politics and policy, in the sense of the devolved governments are being clear that they want harder measures for a longer period of time, while the PM wants to lift measures and move into a slightly different stage. That is a very difficult conflict, I think, for communicators generally when there's divergence in policy direction. That does make life more difficult, but the crux of it was about politics and about policy.
It's not that difficult, is it? I mean, surely the answer is, if the Scottish government, for example, wants to run one type of message and the English or the UK government wants to run a different message in England, then you simply don't buy the advertising space in Scottish newspapers. And if Mr. Johnson is giving a press conference that's going to be broadcast throughout the UK, he makes it clear that the message is only one for England. I mean, is that difficult? I
agree, and I think that sort of moves broadly into where we ended up with sort of regional spaces. But I think in terms of I think the PM at the time was concerned about the politics as well of the issue, with a lot of pressure coming from the media at that point that the measures were too hard and they should be alleviated. And I think this was the starting point of some of that conversation. But Alex would have led on the paid campaign work in this sort of space, as you can see from the email.
The appearance from point 9 there, Mr. Cain, and you were, as you've said, involved in the politics as well as the communications. The appearance is that the Scottish Government's objections were going to be ignored and that the campaign was simply going to be run and that they would try and smooth around the edges after it had been run, which would seem to be disregarding the views of the Scottish Government in a sphere that they had responsibility for.
Well, that's Alex's advice on the piece.
Is it advice you agreed with?
To be honest, I can't remember what position I took on that at the time.
Let me move on, Mr. Cain. Back to your statement, please. Paragraph 78 on page 18. You refer here to the press conferences with the Prime Minister, and as we will all remember, a sort of varied cast of people who appeared on those press conferences, which at least for a time were daily events. And you are here, I think there's a wrong word there, the popularity and impact of the press conferences should not be underestimated, I think you mean. You're saying that they were very important events in the communications cycle. Is that fair?
Correct.
We've been told, Mr. Cain, by Anne Longfield, who was the Children's Commissioner of England at the time, that she, her words, constantly asked the PM and others to have some form of briefing or press conference, especially for children. It was something, she says, that they had done in many countries, and her view was that it was very important for children to know that politicians were thinking of them. Were you aware of that lobbying that she was doing? And do you know why a special children's press conference or briefing was never held?
I was not aware. I think it's a good idea. It's probably something we should have done. I think there are many things we probably should have done, but in the heat of everything, there are, will always be gaps. But I think it's a good idea.
If she's right that she was constantly talking to the Prime Minister about it, isn't it something he might have mentioned to you?
I don't recall him mentioning it to me.
Lady, I'm about to move on to another topic. I wonder if this is a good moment to take a...
Yes, of course. I hope you're warned, Mr. Cain, that we take a break every so often for everybody's sake. I shall return at 12:30.
All rise.